welcome once again to the Upper Room. So glad you've joined us. We're coming to you today from Carbondale, Colorado. Carbondale sits kind of at the base of Mount Sopris. It's an almost 13,000 foot mountain that rises up as a part of the West Elk Range. And we're here for a certain reason. That mountain was named after an explorer. He led an expedition into this area, a European expedition. His name was Richard Sopris. Now, what I find interesting, by the way, he went on to be the mayor of Denver in 1878 for about 4 years. What I find interesting about that story, though, is that in recent years, some folks tried to start a petition to change the name of Mount Sopris. Didn't appreciate Richard Sopris, I guess. I don't know what it was about him. They wanted to change the name to, wait for it, John Denver Mountain. John Denver Mountain. Now, I have as much of an appreciation for John Denver as anybody, but I'm sure glad that they weren't able to change it to John Denver Mountain. I guess they did a poll and 75% of the people in the area here said, no, not changing it to John Denver Mountain. But it reminds me of what we're going to talk about today, because it appears that so many people in our culture today would like to change things that have been the way they are for a long time. Even, and I'm not against change, but even how we view God. In other words, to view God more as a wishy-washy kind of being, that he's not okay with some lifestyles sometimes, and then he is okay with them. You know, he really has no resolve about who he is. It's almost as though there's this petition going around the culture. And the petition is this, you know, it's not to change Mount Sopris to John Denver Mountain, but it's to change how we view God, that he's more of a wishy-washy being, you know, and he has really little resolve. In fact, what we want from God is for God to be relevant, right? God needs to be relevant. He needs to get up with the times. We have a better way of doing things now than the way God ordained them, you know, all those years ago when his word was written. And so you really got to come to a decision as to whether God is a God of resolve, and he's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, as he says, or whether he's what we want to create, and that is something that changes with the times and makes us feel better about our decisions and how we want to live. Well, as you can imagine, I believe that God, and certainly Jesus, who is the exact representation of God, is not concerned about being relevant and changing with the times. He very much is not wishy-washy, but he has what I want to call today resolve. Now, there's a great thing about the word resolve. It's one of those kind of rare words that works both as a verb and as a noun, right? As a verb, resolve is to fix something, to solve something, right? As a noun, it means to have determination, that you'll see it through, whatever that is. Okay, so we're going to start with a discussion question, and here it is. When it comes to Jesus, how does the word resolve relate to Jesus, or how can you connect it to Jesus as both a noun and a verb? All right, just a fun little discussion. Hope you enjoy it. Okay, I find that Jesus has incredible resolve, and it's going to show up in our text today in John chapter 14. We're at the very end of the chapter of John 14. But I believe Jesus had resolve about a lot of things. Specifically, he had resolve about who he was. He had resolve about the fact that pleasing the Father was the focus of his life. And he had resolve about the mission that his Father had given him. So it really begs the question when it comes to my life, if I say that I want to be Christ-like, I want to be a follower, a learner from Jesus, to eventually be transformed into his image, those are great questions for me. Do I have resolve? Do I have resolve about what my life is about, who I am? What do I have resolve about regarding pleasing the Father? And do I have resolve about the mission he's given me, the mission for my life? Do you even know the mission for your life that God has given you? I think they're great questions. I want to take you back to a movie that came out about 7 years ago by the name of When the Game Stands Tall. And it was a movie that starred Jim Caviezel as a coach of the De La Salle football team, De La Salle High School football team in Concord, California. They're in the Bay Area. They accomplished something, rose out of obscurity, and they accomplished something that had never been accomplished before. The story is about the head coach, Bob Ledecour, who took that unknown program on a 151 game winning streak. An amazing feat. And his story unfolds in such an interesting way. But the story within the story that I want to share with you, you don't need to go watch the movie. It's a great movie, but you don't need to watch it. It's about how he had some star football players, as you can imagine, and two of these star football players had both signed letters of intent to get scholarships to play at the University of Oregon. All right, so that was their plan, and sometime during their senior year, these two guys were best friends, and during their senior year, one of them was murdered. He was killed, and at the funeral, the other one walks up to the coach and he says this, "What shall I do now?" As though, you know, those plans now are of no good since my best friend is gone. And Jim Caviezel, playing the coach, looks at him and says these four words that just resounded with me, and I think they're relevant to what we're going to talk about. He just looked at this young man and he said, "Stick to the plan. Stick to the plan." In other words, I know something terrible has happened. I know that this is not how you planned it, but you need to stick to the plan. And so, with that in mind, the question we're going to address today is this: why is it so difficult for us to stick to the plan? And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the plan that God has for our lives. God is not a wishy-washy God. He's not a God that's concerned about being relevant, you know, fitting into our culture like we think he should. He actually has a plan for your life. He has a plan for my life. There's a general plan, of course, but there's very specific things I think he's called you to do, he's called me to do. And the question is, do I have resolve about it? Do I have resolve about whatever it is God has called me to be, to do? Do you have that kind of resolve? Because his son certainly did. And as we get into John 14, and we'll cover 4 verses, verses 28 through 31, I want to show you what I see as hurdles that he easily clears on the path to accomplishing what the Father has for him. And he has resolve about these things. Okay, so we're going to call those 4 hurdles, and we'll get to them in a minute. I just want to read the text, and then I'll show you what I think are the 4 hurdles that Jesus easily clears that most likely you and I struggle with. We stumble over, if you will. And of course, what is a hurdle? A hurdle is any obstacle that stands in our way of getting to the finish line. For us, the finish line is being with Jesus forever. What are the hurdles that may stand in our way that we need to really consider? Now, the ultimate goal that we'll get to in Hebrews 12 is that the answer, I'll tell you the answer before we even start, is to fix our eyes on Jesus. Why is that? Because he cleared these hurdles with ease, I believe, because of his focus on the Father and pleasing the Father. These hurdles are a challenge for you and me. I believe we need to identify those hurdles, identify which hurdles are the most challenging for us, and then once we've identified them, then we fix our eyes on Jesus, and he, I believe, helps us clear these hurdles as we go about having resolved to please the Father. So here we go. We're in John chapter 14, verse 28. So Jesus in verse 28 begins this way: "Remember what I told you, I am going away, but I will come back to you again. If you really love me, you would be happy that I'm going to the Father, who is greater than I am. I've told you these things before they happen, so that when they do happen, you will believe." So in verse 30, he goes on to say this: "I don't have much more time to talk to you because the ruler of this world approaches. He has no power over me, but I will do what the Father requires of me, so that the world will know that I love the Father." And then he ends this chapter ends with this phrase, and we're going to deal with this quickly and then move on back and unpack the rest of it. He ends with this: "Come now, let us leave." Okay, come now, let us leave. Do they get up at this point and leave the upper room is the question. And there's two options. One is simply yes, they now get up and leave the room. Then what is going on as he continues to teach in John 15, 16, 17? What is that about? Or does he stay there, even though he said let's leave, does he stay and finish the teaching? So the first option is that yes, he says let's get up and leave, and they get up and leave. So the question then becomes, is chapters 15, 16, 17, do they not take place in the upper room? Well, if they got up and leave, then they don't, but I would tell you they're an extension of the upper room, that the teaching continues even though physically they weren't in there. The second option is that he said let's get up and go, but they don't actually leave at that point, because the first part of chapter 18 says that they now went across the Kidron Valley over to the Garden of Gethsemane. I tend to land on the second of the two options, that even though Jesus said let's get up and go, the conversation continued. Have you ever experienced that? I know our kids know that that happens a lot. As they were growing up, we would tell them, hey, it's time to go, let's get going. We'd be leaving someone's house or some activity, and then we'd talk for another 20 minutes. So I tend to lean in that direction, especially since the beginning of chapter 18 tells us that they then left and went across the Kidron Valley. Either way, however, it doesn't really matter. I just wanted to address that real quick. It doesn't really matter whether they are actually walking out of and through the city as he continues to talk. It's an extension of the upper room, or whether they stayed there for another 20 minutes as he will pray and do some other things, as we'll find out in the coming chapters. Okay, so from those verses, let me tell you, I think I see resolve in Jesus in about 7 different ways. I'll give them to you real quick just so you can see them. Then we're going to move on to the hurdles that I think he cleared easily in what he said. The 7 issues of resolve he has, let me just read down the list. Number 1, I'm going away but will return. That's about sticking to the mission. I will return. That's what's involved in what I'm going to do. Number 2, the Father is greater than me. That has to do with how he's been about magnifying, intensifying the focus on the Father. The third thing is the things I'm telling you will happen, then you will believe. That's about him, again, delivering the message that they need to hear. The fourth thing that he said, the ruler of this world is coming for me. That's about the mayhem that's about to take place. That, the naked eye, from our point of view, we may not see all the mayhem that goes on between he and the evil one, but he's predicting it's about to happen. The fifth thing he said is the ruler of this world has no power over me. That has to do with the mirage that Satan is so powerful, and we give him that power. Now, he is intelligent, and he is to be given respect, as we've said before, but he doesn't have the power over Jesus, and he doesn't have the power over us. The thought that he does is a mirage. The sixth thing he said is, I will do what the Father requires of me. That is, I will maintain my level of obedience. I will do exactly what the Father's told me. We've talked so much about obedience and how that's the key to loving Jesus. In his words, he's going to maintain that level of obedience by saying, I will now do exactly what the Father tells me to do. And then finally he said, the world will know that I love the Father by my obedience. And so again, he's saying, the important thing here is that everyone gets the message of why I'm here. Okay, those 7 statements he makes to me have to do, again, a lot with the mission and the message of who he is and what he's about. There's a really famous passage out of the Old Testament, out of the book of Jeremiah, that everybody loves to quote, but they take it out of context. Let me give you the context of it, and then we'll talk about that verse real quick. The context is this. The people of Israel have been exiled to Babylon. They've been taken away, and the prophet Jeremiah is speaking for God, and God says to them, you'll be there for 70 years, and then he tells them, he wants to encourage them and say, you know what, learn to live there amongst the Babylonians, and he gives them specific instructions about how to do that. And then this verse shows up from Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Okay, we love to cherry pick that verse out of the context. These people are in Babylon, and they don't know how long. They believe they will all die there, and many of them will die in Babylon, but they're very discouraged. And in the midst of that, Jesus says to them, through the prophet Jeremiah, I know I have plans for you, and they're plans for you to prosper, and I'm going to be with you. That's the idea. Okay, I believe that it's wrong to cherry pick that and apply it to us, although the general idea is true in our lives. No matter what we are experiencing, and you and I live in a foreign land, don't we? We live in a foreign land. We are aliens here. It's not totally unlike the Israelites who had been taken to Babylon. And I believe the idea applies to us, even though that was not directly said to us. The idea is that God still has a plan for our lives, even though we live in a corrupt and dying culture. And He will be with us, and He wants us to experience all that He has for us. Okay, having said that, again, God has a plan. It may not make sense right now. You may not understand it right now. You may think that He has absolutely abandoned you. I believe the Israelites believed that, and that's why He said, I have plans for you to prosper, for you to do well, and I will not leave you or forsake you. I'll be with you through that. Okay, having said that, for us to live out the plan that God has for us, again, I believe we're going to encounter some specific hurdles that were true in this case here. So again, what's a hurdle? A hurdle is just an obstacle. Hebrew writer talks about this in chapter 12, verse 1. Let us strip off every weight that slows us down. So he refers to it as a weight that pulls on us. We're calling it a hurdle. It's any kind of an obstacle that keeps us from accomplishing what God has for us. He says, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus. Okay, so first he says, you've got some things weighing you down. You need to note what that is. That's what we're going to do with these hurdles. What are the things we're tripping over, most likely? But the key is to then return to fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Because of the joy awaiting Him, He endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Okay, so He overcame obstacles. He overcame things that He had to overcome in order to fulfill the plans that the Father had for Him, the mission He had for Him. Okay, so the four challenges, or the four hurdles that I see in this passage that Jesus is easily clearing, that we, I believe, struggle with. I'll speak for myself. I struggle with. So they are emotions, ego, enemy, and exceptional thinking. Okay, let me explain each one of those one by one. We'll delve into each one for just a little bit. Okay, the first one is emotions. It's difficult for us to understand how thick the emotions were in that room. But we know that's the case because Jesus said in chapter 14, verse 1, and in chapter 14, verse 27, do not let your hearts be troubled. Do not let your hearts be troubled. He says again, do not be afraid. He sees on their faces. He knows what lies ahead for them, that they are emotionally distraught. Okay, it's a very emotional time. It's an emotional time for Jesus as well. And so it begs the question, are emotions dangerous for us? So go back to verse 28 that we read right away. It says, you heard me say I'm going away and I'm coming back to you. If you love me, He says, you would be glad. So He addresses their emotion of fear and doubt. And He says, if you really knew me, here's the emotion that would take over, and that is you would be glad about what I'm about to do, if you could really understand. But emotions tend to be a hurdle for many of us. For many of us, we allow emotions to run our lives. And a long-standing question is, are emotions good or bad? Well, we know that God gave us emotions, right? So we know that they in themselves are not bad. We know that Jesus had emotions. Matthew 9:36 says He had compassion on the people of Jerusalem. He was angry when He went into the temple. He wept in John 11:35 at the tomb of Lazarus. We know that Jesus had emotions. The difference is that what He was emotional about is usually different than what we're emotional about. All right? We tend to be emotional about things, how they affect me, and emotions can overrun me. And at crucial times when I need to make a decision, when I need to have resolve about something, I can let emotions take over, become the key to my life. A great example of this is James and John, the brothers who were disciples of Jesus, who came to Jesus and they were livid, they were ticked that the Samaritans would not let them come through their area. And they said, Jesus, we want you to command that lightning come down, fire come down and destroy them. They're very emotional and they're willing to sacrifice tens of thousands of people because their emotions overrun them. And you might remember that Jesus said basically, calm down, boys. So emotions can be used in a good way, but with Jesus, the emotions were always about how the circumstances were affecting the kingdom not so much how frustrated he was. There's a guy by the name of Alistair Groves, who is the director and coordinator of counseling services and the Educational Foundation, and I like how he puts it. Let me read it to you. He says this: "The loudest voice in the Western world tells us that our emotions are everything, the things that most define us. Given this, the next step our culture takes is quite natural. You need to be and express yourself at pretty much all costs." He uses phrase that we use all the time, like "get something off your chest," or blow your top, or tell them what you're thinking. That's what we do with emotions. Is if I have it, I need to express it. Well, maybe, but there needs to be some control on that, right? We would say, as followers of Jesus, the control on that is the Holy Spirit. If the emotion is there because the kingdom is being attacked or wronged, or people are given the wrong perception of God and his kingdom, emotion is great. But if it's just a personal vendetta, and that's what most of us have when things don't go our way, frustration, that's where we can get into trouble with emotion. I got to tell you that the modern church really taps into emotion an awful lot, almost in a scary way. Whether it's the preaching or the music or the programs, they really feed on people's emotions, and people tend to talk about the modern church in terms of their emotions, right? They say, "Oh, that felt really good," or I really liked how that sounded, or how this felt. We use emotions to evaluate whether or not God's involved in something. And in fact, Jesus is working with the emotions of the disciples, and he's saying, you're frustrated, you're scared, you're fearful, you should be glad. You should learn the right emotion, because the wrong emotion can become a hurdle to us actually experiencing what God has us to experience, or to finish, to have resolve towards finishing what God has called for us to do. So a quick discussion question again. Can you tell of a time when emotions kind of overran you and really changed the decision you made, a choice you made, and maybe altered it in a negative way? Or maybe it was in a positive way, but oftentimes emotions will alter our decisions in a negative way. Can you just talk about that for just a minute? So typically, emotions, we usually deal with them in one of two extremes. One, we just minimize them. They have nothing to do with life. That's kind of honestly a kind of a guy approach. Forget the emotions, that's not important. Or we maximize them and they run our lives. And Groves, again, let me quote him one more time. Groves says this: "We need a third way, a way that takes our emotions seriously without handing them the keys to our life." Okay, so the red flag is this: if what I feel or what I want overruns my decisions in life that should be based on what God wants, what God has planned, what God is calling me to be, that's a red flag. All right. The second hurdle is ego. We pick it up in verse 28, the second part, when Jesus says, "I'm going to the Father who is greater than I am." Okay, we need to explain that, because some use that verse to say, see, Jesus and God were not equal. Well, there's a plethora of passages, and we've used them before. You can find them where Jesus claims to being God. So that is not what he's saying. He's not saying that we're not equal. What he is saying is he's checking his ego at the door, and he's saying, I'm giving deference, I am deferring to the Father. I am submitting to his will. In order to defer to God and his will, we have to check our ego at the door, don't we? And yet many of us don't, and it's really the greatest challenge we have. It's my desires, my wishes versus God's desires and pleasing the Father. I'm going to run through just a quick list of passages where it's dealt with, and then we'll move on. Luke chapter 9 verse 23, and Jesus said, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." Deny yourself. Deny the ego. Matthew 16:24, then Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Says it again. Mark 8:34, and calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." 3 times in a row. Luke 14:26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, and yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. We understand the word hate there means the comparison between our affections for ourselves, our family, and our affection for God, our priority that God has in our life, it almost appears as though we hate ourselves. And I know there's a big movement in our culture today, even in the church, that says you must first love yourself. Well, that's not what Jesus said. We go to 2 Corinthians 5:15, and he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. No more living for yourself, no more ego once you come to the cross. And finally, Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. My ego has been put on the cross. It has been crucified. Okay, so the second hurdle, and I think it may be the greatest hurdle for us, is our own egos. The third hurdle is an interesting one, and it's the enemy. So Jesus speaks of the enemy in verse 30. The ruler of this world approaches. He has no power over me. Okay, right there he just flat out expresses the fact that there is a realm that you and I cannot see on this earth. And the ruler of this earth is, of course, Satan. And he says he's coming for me. He's approaching me. The battle is ensuing. I will be up against it. So there's two things that Jesus says about the ruler of this world right here in this passage. Number one, he lurks. He is around, and he does approach us as he's about to approach Jesus. He lurks. Number two, he has limited power. Let's deal with the first one, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10. Paul writes a final word, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on all God's armor so that you will be able to stand firm against all strategies of the devil. We're going to come back to that. Other translations say the schemes of the devil. For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies. This is not a physical fight, he says, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. Okay, there are many of us who just kind of forget that this battle is going on and how real it is, but it's an invisible battle, and it has to do with the strategies of Satan that are sometimes difficult to recognize, but we must recognize them. And in fact, Paul says, and you must stand firm against them. So let me give you just one example. We could talk about a myriad of the things going on around us in this culture that are definitely strategies of the evil one that may be difficult to recognize at first, okay? So not to offend anybody, but I don't really care if you're offended. We're going to talk about BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement. This movement began in 2012. Three ladies who are, by their own words, trained Marxists, began this movement in 2012 in response to a not guilty verdict for a guy by the name of George Zimmerman in Florida when he killed Trayvon Martin. So they began this movement, and the three gals who began this movement are Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi. Here's what you need to know about these three founders and leaders of this movement. Number one, they, as they said in their own words, they are trained Marxists. We've talked about Marxism before. That's the current that's running through our culture right now, and it's so no wonder that their philosophy has become very famous, very popular. They're trained Marxists. Number two, they're absolutely, unequivocally anti-family. All right, they want nothing to do with the family, and that is because God ordained the family, and so their goal is to destroy the family. So without a doubt, they are all in with the LGBTQ plus movement. Which is really aimed at destruction of the God-ordained family. Although they've taken a lot of this off their website, people got snapshots of that website to know that that's really what is behind the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not about racism at all, it's about Marxism. And in fact, these leaders, Cullors, and the head of the chapter in Los Angeles, Dr. Melina Abdullah, regularly seek spirits. They seek evil spirits for ideas and how they should next approach their strategies. Okay, they speak of this. You need to know that even though this culture has accepted this movement, it has evil intentions, it is of the devil. This has always been around. That's why Jesus talked about the prince of this earth is coming to me. There's going to be a battle. It's always been around. Evil spirits, evil has been around, even though we can't see it always. But what's concerning to me is this, that the modern church is adopting and adapting the BLM movement. What was it Paul said? stand firm against the strategies, the schemes of Satan. And in the current world in which we live, the modern church is not, by and large, standing against it. They are accepting it because we have bought the lie from Satan that that's how we will love these people, is accept whatever they tell us and join them in their efforts. I tell you that because the third hurdle is the enemy. 1 Peter 5:8, Peter says, the devil prowls about this earth like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. He says, stand firm, be alert. Those are war terms. See, the modern church they're not about the war. The modern church is about love in the context of, accept everybody's ideas and let them join with them, hold hands with them in anything they want to do. Those are the devil's schemes. I don't know how else to tell you that. I said earlier then that he lurks about and we see it. If we're watching, if you're paying attention, you'll see it. But he also, secondly, has limited power over us. 1 John 4:4, but you belong to God, John says. You have already won a victory over those people because the Spirit who lives in you is greater than the spirit who lives in the world. Okay, let's go to our fourth and final hurdle, and that hurdle is simply exceptional thinking. And I know what that sounds like that shouldn't be a hurdle. That's a good thing, right? If you have exceptional thinking, you have extraordinary thinking, but we're using the word exceptional in the sense of I am the exception kind of thinking. So that's totally different. And what we're talking about is that in verse 31, Jesus says of chapter 14, he says, I will do whatever the Father requires of me. That way the world will know that I love the Father, that I love him. Okay, I will do whatever the Father requires. He's been talking about how love and obedience are connected. And in our day and age, it is so tempting to say, I don't think that I should have to do that, right? Whatever that is. I think I'm the exception. Well, the Son of God didn't even think that he was the exception to the standard of doing whatever the Father asks of him. And when he says that, I believe we now see a hurdle before us that most of us are so much more interested in what I want to do than what the Father wants me to do. And so in a sense, we see ourselves as the exception. That's for other people. The modern church, to be honest with you, is filled with people who think that, I shouldn't have to do those things. Again, going back to your whole view of God. God has not kept up with the time, so I should not have to do those kinds of things. Whatever it is the Father has asked us to do in this day and age. So we have exceptional thinking, not, again, great thinking, but instead, I'm someone special. When the Son of God himself said, I will do whatever he requires. He didn't think he was so special that he didn't have to do that. Again, he was equal to God, and yet he submitted. And that idea of submitting, and that's what obedience is really foreign to us in the modern church. Okay, so you may be asking, okay, so what? So we have these hurdles. Is it really that big a deal, this resolve thing? I can see how Jesus has resolved to finish the plan, finish the mission that his Father gave him. If you're really wondering whether this is necessary, I want to take you to Luke chapter 9. So in Luke chapter 9, here's what we read. As they were walking along, someone said to Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go. Doesn't that sound like resolve? Incredible resolve. Watch how Jesus tests it, though. But Jesus replied, foxes have dens to live in, and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Meaning, I don't think you really do have that kind of resolve that it's going to take to be with me all the time. Verse 59 goes on. He said to another person, come, follow me. The man agreed, but then he said, Lord, first let me return home and bury my father. We talked about that before. It's not that his father had died, it's that he will be dying in the next year or so, and he wants the inheritance, so he has to be there when he dies. And Jesus famously says to him, let the dead spiritually bury the dead. Come and follow me. Again, verse 61, another said, Lord, I will follow you, but first let me say goodbye to my family. And Jesus says, anyone who puts his hand to the plow and then looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God. There it is. You can't put your hand to the plow. You can't start the mission of living in the kingdom and then second guess yourself and look back and think, I'm not sure I want to do this. Maybe I want to go back to where I was. It's lack of resolve is what he's saying. You must have resolve if you want to live for me and live in my kingdom.
That's what this whole passage is about. I believe that's what Jesus is saying here in chapter 14 of John in the upper room. Let's wrap this up with a story about Helen Keller. You probably know the name Helen Keller. She was made famous by the book and the play and the movie, The Miracle Worker. It's the story about how she was, at a very young age, blind and dumb, meaning without speech, and her parents found a gal by the name of Annie Sullivan who taught her how to read Braille by writing in the palm of her hand with her index finger. Helen Keller went on to do amazing things. She graduated with a Bachelor's of Arts, first one ever to graduate who was blind and could not speak. She wrote many books. She was socially, politically active, all those things. She actually learned to write and read in Braille in like 5 or 6 different languages, English and Italian and German and Greek and Latin and French. She did amazing things. Honestly, later in life, she kind of went off the rails spiritually. I don't want to go too deep into that, but I want to talk about how she got to that place with Annie Sullivan. She was born in Alabama, and her mom, Kate, and her dad, Arthur, decided after reading a Charles Dickens book. In this Charles Dickens book, there was a real true story of a girl named Laura Bridgman, and she had been blind and had learned how to read. And so they wanted that for their daughter. So they, in 1886, now think about it, they didn't just jump on a plane. In 1886, they traveled from Alabama to Baltimore. And in Baltimore, they looked up at this doctor who was an expert. His name was Dr. Julian Chisholm. They looked him up and said, "Can you help us?" Well, he said, I don't know that I can help you, but I know someone who can. Dr. Chisholm got him in touch with one Alexander Graham Bell. Yes, that Alexander Graham Bell. And he said, "I can't help you, but I think I know someone who can." Has that ever been a part of your story? People just keep saying, "I think I know someone who can help you." He sent them to the Perkins Institute in Boston, and the director of the Perkins Institute said, "I have got just the person for you." And he introduced them to Annie Sullivan, who by then was 20 years old, had graduated from the Perkins Institute for the deaf and for the blind, and then the rest is history. Now, I want to fill you in on Annie's story. You know a lot about Helen Keller, but the resolve that it took for Helen's parents is amazing to me. But it wasn't just them. Annie Sullivan grew up in a home where she lost both her mother and father at a very young age, her mother to tuberculosis. A few years later, when she was probably about 8 or 9, she and her brother were in a home and he died, so she was all alone. She got moved around from home to home. Quite honestly, she ended up in an institution where incredible abuse was going on. There's a lot of proof that she was physically, emotionally, even sexually abused. After all that, she pleaded to find her way into the Perkins Institute, where she graduated in 1886. And what I want you to hear, I told you that Helen Keller kind of went off the rails, spiritually speaking. Listen to the valedictorian speech. She was first in her class, Annie Sullivan was. She had had 5 surgeries, that none of them corrected her blindness. Annie Sullivan gave this speech at her graduation. "Fellow graduates, duty bids us go forth into active life. Let us go cheerfully, hopefully, and earnestly, and set ourselves to find our especial part. When we have found it, willingly and faithfully perform it. For every obstacle we overcome, read hurdle, every success we achieve tends to bring man closer to God and make life more as He would have it." Isn't that incredible? There was no doubt in her mind that she had been given a mission. She didn't know what it was. She had no idea she would meet one Helen Keller just weeks or months later, and her life would be changed forever. But what she had was resolve. From her childhood, which was as poor of a childhood as anyone could have, to the point where she says this: if we will follow God's plan for our life, that's basically what she was saying, He will show us what it is He wants of us, and people will be drawn to Him. I would tell you that Helen Keller's story is a great story about resolve and achievement in the human sense. I would tell you that Annie Sullivan's story, which without Annie Sullivan there is no Helen Keller. Annie Sullivan's story is a story of a God plan, a God mission that comes to fruition. Don't think for a second that Annie Sullivan didn't have many hurdles in front of her, and yet she cleared them all and did what God called her to do. What John 14 verses 28 through 31 tell me is that Jesus had resolve about who he was, resolve about what his mission was, resolve about making sure that his Father was pleased with everything he did, that he was obedient to the last detail. How is your resolve? Do you have resolve about who you are? About what God's plan for your life is? Generally, at least. He'll unfold the specifics. Do you have resolve that you will finish it, that you will not stumble over any hurdle? Let me finish by reading again from Hebrews chapter 12. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance, with resolve, the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. It was finished. He had resolved, and he showed us how to live with resolve. Do you have resolve? Well, we're now on the backside of Mount Sopris. We changed positions. I hope you can see it over my shoulder. I told you we came here because of the great story of Richard Sopris and how they wanted to change the mountain to John Denver, thinking that, just like God, he's willy-nilly and his mind can be changed about anything. There was another reason, however, that we came to Mount Sopris, and that is we have a friend. We have a friend and his wife who live in Tucson, who are part of the Tucson churches, and Tom Wisely and his wife Sandy have a daughter who live in this area, and Tom put in a special request that we film for Mount Sopris. Isn't that great? I bet you didn't know we do special requests. I guess we're doing special requests now. Tom, hope you enjoyed Mount Sopris from both sides. We did it for you. More than that, we did it for Jesus, the one who had the greatest resolve ever on this earth. Thanks for being with us.